I was searching for something. It said it was, but suffice to say.
Hello guys, I want to talk about a list of cognitive biases that are known as cognitive biases, which describe a replicable pattern in perceptual distortion, inaccurate judgment. There are many cognitive biases which we're going to talk about today, and they describe replicable patterns in perceptual distortion, also inaccurate judgment, illogical interpretation, which is broadly known as, it's broadly called irrationality. So what are they? They are the result of distortions in the human mind that always lead to the same pattern of poor judgment, often triggered by a particular situation, identifying poor judgment, or more precisely a deviation in judgment, which requires a standard for comparison. In scientific investigations of cognitive bias, the source of good judgment is that of people outside the situation hypothesized to cause the poor judgment, or if possible, also a set of independently verifiable facts. So the existence of most of the particular cognitive biases listed, which I will list, have been verified empirically in psychology experiments. Excuse me. So cognitive biases are influenced by evolution and natural selection pressure. Some are presumably adaptive and beneficial, for example, because they lead to more effective actions in given contexts, or enable faster decisions when faster decisions are of greater value for reproductive success and survival. Others presumably result from a lack of appropriate mental mechanisms. So you've got a lack of mental mechanisms, a general fault in human brain structure, for example, from the misapplication of a mechanism that is adaptive, beneficial under different circumstances, or simply from noisy mental processes. So despite several decades of effort, no comprehensive theory of what creates these biases has emerged. This is why it is not straightforward to group and categorize them, and this results in what has been called a grab bag of heuristics and biases with no quantitative psychological theory describing the underlying processes. A psychological bulletin article suggested that at least 8 seemingly unrelated biases can be produced by the same information theoretic generative mechanisms that assume noisy information processing during storage and retrieval of information in human memory. So the decision-making belief and behavioural biases, this is what we need to focus on, decision-making beliefs and biases. Many of these biases affect belief formation, business and economic decisions, and human behaviour in general. They arise as a replicable result to a specific condition. When confronted with a specific situation, the deviation from what is normatively expected can be characterised by several of these. I can name a few. Ambiguity effect. Now, the tendency to avoid options for which missing information makes the probability seem unknown. That's for the ambiguity effect. We've also got one as anchoring. We could say, with anchoring, the tendency to rely too heavily or anchor on a past reference or on one trait or piece of information when making decisions, also called insufficient adjustment. Attentional bias. What do we mean by attentional bias? The tendency of emotionally dominant stimuli in one's environment to preferentially draw and hold attention and to neglect relevant data when making judgment of a correlation or association. Availability heuristic, which is estimating what is more likely by what is more available in memory, which is biased towards vivid, unusual, or emotionally charged examples. Availability cascade, a self-reinforcing process in which a collective belief gains more and more plausibility through its increasing repetition in public discourse or repeat something long enough and it will become true. The backfire effect. When people react to this confirming evidence by strengthening their beliefs. So it's this conforming evidence. The bandwagon effect, which is quite popular among societies all over the world. The tendency to do or believe things because many other people do or believe the same, related to groupthink and herd behaviour. And then we have the base rate neglect or base rate fallacy, the tendency to base judgment on specifics, ignoring general statistical information. A belief bias, an effect where someone's evaluation of the logical strength of an argument is biased by the believability of the conclusion. Bias blind spot, the tendency to see oneself as less biased than other people, or to be able to identify more cognitive biases in others than in oneself. Choice supported bias, the tendency to remember one's choices better than they actually were. Clustering illusion, the tendency to under-expect runs, streaks or clusters in small samples of random data. Confirmation bias, which is also a very common one in society, the tendency to search for or interpret information in a way that confirms one's preconceptions. Congruence bias, the tendency to test hypotheses exclusively through direct testing in contrast to test of possible alternative hypotheses. Conjunction fallacies, the tendency to assume that specific conditions are more probable than general ones. Conservatism or regressive bias, normally a tendency to underestimate high values and high likelihoods, probabilities, frequencies, and overestimate low ones. Based on the observed evidence, estimates are not extreme enough. So the estimates do not become extreme enough. Conservatism, biasm, the tendency to believe updates insufficiently but predictably as a result of new evidence. Estimates of conditional probabilities are conservative. The contrast effect, the enhancement or diminishing of a weight or other measurement when compared with a recently observed contrasting object. I like these sesame seeds, they're really nice. Another popular one, the curse of knowledge, when better informed people lose the ability to understand lesser informed people. Better informed people lose the ability to understand lesser informed people. The decoy effect, preferences change when there is a third option that is asymmetrically dominated. Denomination effect, the tendency to spend more money when it is denominated in small amounts rather than large amounts. Have you ever tried that? Spending more money because you have smaller amounts of money rather than large amounts? So you've got 1,010 pences and you spend more. The distinction bias, the tendency to view two options as more dissimilar when evaluating them simultaneously than when evaluating them separately. The duration neglect, the neglect of the duration of an episode in determining its value. The empathy gap, the tendency to underestimate the influence or strength of feelings in either oneself or others. The endowment effect, the fact that people often...
I was searching for something. I couldn't say what it was, but suffice to say, I would know when I saw it. I wanted to go to New York, but you know, all that construction. And then, all of a sudden, it found me.
Things according to their essential nature, in spite of variations, exaggerated expectation based on the estimates. Real world evidence turns out to be less extreme than our expectations. Inverse of the conservatism. Experimenters or expectation bias. The tendency for experimenters to believe, certify and publish data that agree with their expectations for the outcome of an experiment, and to disbelieve, discard or downgrade the corresponding weightings for data that appear to conflict with those expectations. The functional fixedness limits a person to using an object only in a way it is traditionally used. The focusing effect, the tendency to place too much importance on one aspect of an event, causes error, inaccuracy, inaccurately predicting the utility of a future outcome. Also, we have the framing effect, drawing different conclusions from the same information depending on how that information is presented. Frequency illusion, the illusion in which a word, a name or other thing that has recently come to one's attention suddenly appears everywhere with improbable frequency. You can also refer to recency illusion, sometimes called the Bader-Meinhof phenomena. The gambler's fallacy. The gambler's fallacy, you've heard of that one too. The tendency to think that future probabilities are altered by past events, when in reality they are unchanged, results from an erroneous conceptualization of the law of large numbers. For example, I flipped heads with this coin 5 times consecutively, so the chance of tails coming out on the 6th flip is much greater than heads. The hard-easy effect, based on a specific level of task difficulty, the confidence in judgment is too conservative and not extreme enough. The hindsight bias, sometimes called I knew it all along effect, the tendency to see past events as being